everybody. I'm Nicole Harris-Roberts with Vinyl, and I'm here today for a fireside chat with Marcus Ryu. He is the chairman and co-founder of Guideware Software, in conversation with Eric Herring, CTO and partner at Vinyl. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for joining us, Marcus.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
We want to hear your startup story. You've been very successful. Many people who are watching this probably know who Guidewire is, and so tell us about it.
Well, I describe myself as an entrepreneur, but I've started precisely one company in my career. I had a very, very simple career after deciding that I wasn't going to be a professional philosopher, which is what I was educated in and went to graduate school for. I had a very brief stint at the consulting firm McKinsey, and then everyone there had concluded in the late 90s that the center of the universe was Silicon Valley. So I conspired to get over here. Worked briefly for a very successful B2B software company at the time called Ariba, which was later acquired by SAP. But in 2001, left with 5 other smart guys that I had met both at Ariba and elsewhere, and we co-founded a company called Guidewire, which was then my life's work for the next 18 years. I led for most of the last half of that. I was the CEO of the company, including in our IPO in 2012. And then about 12 months ago, I stepped down as CEO and remained chairman of the company to pursue the next entrepreneurial project. So it was a pretty extraordinary journey. It was arduous most of the way, but it had the rewards that only come from doing something kind of reckless and difficult and somehow against the odds succeeding. And it's my pleasure to be able to talk about it now, with most of it in hindsight.
So for those people who maybe aren't as familiar with Guidewire, say a little bit about the business you were in, because it's interesting the business you chose and why you chose it.
Sure. So Guideware is a very simple company strategically. We serve one industry, the global property and casualty insurance industry. It's about $2 trillion in total size. The companies everyone would have heard of would be Farmers Insurance, State Farm, Travelers, and the like. There are about 1,500 insurance companies around the world. It's very different from life insurance and health insurance. So think about damage to vehicles, to property, also some things like directors and officers insurance. Basically, insurance that indemnifies you against some terrible random thing happening, other than health or life. So our business is simply to build the big transactional systems that replace the big iron transactional systems, which are generally built in the mainframe era. So it's about as unglamorous a business as you can imagine, but it has the virtue. It's also extremely difficult to build the software, extremely difficult to sell it, very difficult to implement it because it's so complicated what you're trying to transform at the customer site. But if you can overlook those little challenges, it has the great reward that we build very strategic relationships with customers, generally for life. Essentially, no customer ever leaves us once we form that relationship, though it may take them 5 or 8 years to make that decision. And it's a very durable, very strategic kind of relationship that we get to have. Very specialized, kind of obscure, but actually a surprisingly large market, considering that we serve one of the largest industries in the world.
So some of the characteristics of the company that you just identified, you clearly only fully knew or fully appreciated in hindsight, but how much of this did you know going in? Like how much of this was part of your strategic thesis in founding the company?
Well, we made a lot of mistakes along the way, but one thing we really got right in the early days was this kind of somewhat contrarian view. Of course, we started the company in 2001, so that was intrinsically contrarian. People felt like the world was ending. But the contrarian thing strategically was that we said, we're going to build an enterprise software company that only serves one industry. Back in 20 years ago, the conventional wisdom was you want to invent a new 3-letter acronym and have something that every company in the world could use. And hopefully if either become your own great company or maybe be acquired by SAP or Oracle or something like that. Our thesis was that most of the most strategic kind of neglected areas in software were specific to an industry, and that was the big dark matter that had not been explored by technology entrepreneurs. So we were one of the earlier vertically specific enterprise software companies. And the conventional wisdom was like, those markets are too small, they're too obscure, they take too long. And I take some pride in being a counterexample to that. to say, actually, you're doing something very strategic. That there's a very high barrier to entry, but if you can get to the other side of it, you can form these very durable strategic relationships, and you have a huge barrier to entry behind you. And we were willing to pay a lot of sweat equity to get to the other side of that moat.
Right. Yeah, the SaaS conventional wisdom these days, at least if you spend too much time on HackerNet, is find the person in the if you want to build an enterprise SaaS solution, you find the person in the enterprise that has the spreadsheet that runs the whole business, and you replace the spreadsheet, right? So you were a trailblazer in that respect.
Yeah, and I think another part of the conventional wisdom we defied was, let's do something very complicated and hairy and difficult, not something that can be quickly adopted, not something that has viral spreading characteristics, something that really solves a deep and profound strategic problem. Our metaphor for it over the years was, we're just going to go straight into the rock face here. We're not going to look for a quick way around the mountain. We're just going to tunnel straight through the granite of it. And the reward will be that others will not follow, or others have not been here, and others will find it challenging to follow, as if we don't die in the process. So that's more or less how it worked out.
Yeah, no, the victors write history, right? All right, so I want to pull on one thread from what you just said. So you started this company post 9/11. In your words, when it seemed like the world was ending, and that probably seems to a lot of the audience like an interesting choice, especially when you all probably had jobs and you could have just put your heads down and weathered the dot-com bust and everything else, and waited to come out the other side like so many people did. But that time also has some interesting echoes with today, just with the overall stress and the uncertainty in the economy and whatnot. So, what did you learn from that? Why did you do it? What did you learn from it? And what parallels would you draw to entrepreneurs who are maybe deciding to start a business, today, right now, after they watch this?
Well, the truthful answer as to why I did or we did was we were young and reckless and just had decided that we were put on this earth to be entrepreneurs, rightly or wrongly. And this is what we were going to do. We had made the decision to start the company, as it turns out, about a month before 9/11. And 2 weeks after 9/11, we said, this is a calamity, but we knew that we knew it was going to be difficult. So only more so. So our first week in the office was 2 weeks after that horrific event. Our intention was contrarian by nature. We said, look, there's been a recklessness during this dot-com era. People are going to have a hangover from it. But great companies are started during times of adversity, and the inputs into this process to build a company are primarily talent, and you need some computers and infrastructure, and all of that's abundant now at a time. The one thing that's not abundant was capital, and so it was a humbling journey to raise capital for the company. It took us almost a year and a half, almost 2 years, and it was not at a great valuation. But everything else more or less played out as we had hoped. I would say the parallel to the present is, a very different set of challenges, and many people have opined. So I won't add my own political gloss to it. But I would say there's a sense that maybe the abundance of the earlier era isn't here now, and that this is just a harder time to do anything. And I defy that conventional wisdom if that's what it is. The one thing that is very abundant is certainly capital, and for the right ideas, many people in the Valley will say there's just far too much capital chasing not enough talent and not enough great ideas. So if you have those, then you can get capitalized. You can get what you need to get underway. But also, I think the returns to talent and the returns to great software engineering have never been as great as they are now. The superabundance of computing power, just extraordinary open source universe of resources, of libraries, extraordinary public cloud infrastructure to be used. All of these things are incredible accelerants to building a company. And also there's a much broader appreciation that you don't have to all be co-located in the same place. And that gives you even more degrees of freedom. So I would defy anyone that says that this is a harder time to start a company than any time in the past. I'd say in most respects, it's an easier time.
I definitely agree with all that. That's an interesting perspective.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'm so impressed by with the entrepreneurial environment in Boise is that for the most part, the companies we meet there that are starting in Boise are are solving hard problems. And I like that. I do think you made me think of this talking about all the accelerants that are available. And I do think there are too many companies now that are just pasting a bunch of stuff other people did together and adding metaphorically speaking, at least a few lines of code and trying to sell it, through Facebook campaigns or whatever, through viral spread. And so what advice, do you have? I know this is a hard question to have generic advice. What advice do you have for people who are trying to solve, hard problems in old mainline industries, coming, and if there's any particular angle that Boise adds to that, what would you tell these entrepreneurs?
Well, I very much applaud the sentiment of going for the hard problem, the hard problem that where there's true value creation. Too many, I think, initial entrepreneurial ideas, the ideas that I like to say you can think up in the shower, are they're superficial in nature and they don't have a clear value thesis. Like what is the substantive source of improvement that you bring, and therefore kind of principled basis for you to be compensated, at Guidewire, we would say, look, this is the most unglamorous work imaginable, but this is an industry that's vital to modern civilization. It indemnifies ordinary people against disaster, and they have ancient systems. This is a problem that we can make the world better with better software. And the fact that no one else is here is our opportunity, and the fact that it's difficult is our justification for why we want to be compensated for doing it well. Right. And there's an infinite number of such problems, but they're not ones that you just think up in the shower. They're ones that you have to get out in the world and talk to people who have gotten their fingernails dirty trying to solve it, and then you have to develop a thesis for why it'll be better. In terms of advice, I'll just share or convey the one best piece of advice I was given as an entrepreneur in the earliest days, which is to really understand your source of strength. When you start a company, you have no assets, you have no reputation, you have no product, you have no team, you have no references, you have no brand, you have none of the assets that a company likes to have that is the basis of their conventional enterprise value and strength. You have one asset, though, that is truly precious, that's worth more than all of those things if you get it right. And that's the ability to just hit the headpin of demand exactly right, to just nail what it is that customer or market needs more precisely than any of the incumbents. And that, if you get that right, that can be worth more than the rest combined, because you can build everything else. And I say with some pride, my company was able to do that. We realized that the market was incredibly unhappy with their choices. They had a very dim reputation, a dim impression of software companies, of technology companies, and they had a problem that they could articulate with great enthusiasm, with great passion, that was not being met. And so we said we can just nail that demand because no one else is here. No one else has bothered to listen. And I think if you make the most out of that, you can turn something into nothing, or nothing into something.
Yeah, for sure. I tell people all the time. Actually, I haven't told anybody recently, so thank you for reminding me that I used to tell people this all the time, and that is the most interesting problems are the ones that have a last mover advantage.
Yes, indeed.
So that was an interesting framing of that for sure. So when we talked, you had a really interesting framing of kind of the Silicon Valley version, at least. Maybe it's a universal version, you tell me, of the entrepreneur's life path, of the entrepreneur's journey. And you talked about it in terms of chapters. And we're gonna talk about your latest effort now that you're no longer the CEO and you've made room in your life for your next thing. We're going to talk about that in a second, and you called that chapter 3. So walk me through the chapters, or walk us through the chapters, and tell us what you think about, is that Silicon Valley specific? Is it entrepreneurial specific? Can the people in Boise have the same chapters? How does it work?
Indeed, yeah. What we were talking about is a kind of variation on the American dream, which is come here with nothing and make a better life in a generation for your kids. There's a kind of accelerated version of that in Silicon Valley, which has been a blessed place this last generation, which is you can come to work for an extraordinary company, be around a lot of talented people, and that's your first job. And then on the basis of that, you can come up with an entrepreneurial idea and maybe meet a few co-founders, and you can go to your second chapter and start your own company. And of course, you'll need capital, to go along the way, and investors will be rewarded if you succeed. But if you succeed, then you'll have enough of a basis to then take a third chapter and really start a company entirely on your own terms, hopefully with the benefit of some wisdom and other relationships that you've made, and really have a canvas of autonomy to realize your vision then. So this kind of 3-chapter story or 3-chapter arc is one that I think a number of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs have, and I had it as well coming out here. And my second chapter ended up being quite long, almost 2 decades. I have no regrets about that, but it's afforded me now, it's afforded me a kind of canvas to take a shot for a third time, maybe in some ways a bit more ambitiously than the second, but hopefully not too chastened by the mistakes to be too cautious. And I think that's an extraordinary thing that is not only true of Silicon Valley. It's a place where it has been realized in spectacular form, but there's nothing geographically anchored about that intention. And I would urge anyone with anyone with technical talent, anyone with entrepreneurial intention, find the smartest people you can in the beginning. Don't think about compensation. Don't think about perks. Think about where can I be with the smartest people who are the most industrious, who are the most imaginative, working in a high functioning place. And then when you're ready to take that shot, what is that problem I can engage with? Don't worry about how much it's going to enrich you. Don't worry about the details of all of the insider baseball of venture funding. Just get funded and solve a problem, and then take a shot the third time. And I think a human life is long enough to encompass all of that if you're fortunate.
Right on. So this is, like I said, this is Boise Startup Week. So should all the people who are listening to this, should they pack up their car and drive to Silicon Valley right now, or can they follow this arc in Boise? And should they follow this arc in Boise?
Well, I would say we're having this conversation at a time when California is a bit. It's been humbled. It's been a little shaken, I'll say. I had a few weeks ago. My house was 102 degrees, and then the power went out, and I said, "This is a little disconcerting." So, I think it's a time when a lot of people in the area have said, maybe this isn't quite the paradise that we had imagined it to be. But all that aside, all those short-term facts aside, I don't think the talent is that Silicon Valley is any monopoly on talent whatsoever. In fact, the nature of Guidewire's business it took me through a lot of other places in the country, including Idaho and many other Midwestern states, because that's where insurance companies are, and have historically been kind of situated around many times agricultural cooperatives and the like. And I got to appreciate, look, there's technical talent very widely distributed across this country. And there's nothing particularly unique about the Valley, other than you have a lot of people who have taken it into their heads to start companies, and I think that's being realized by other geographies. There's no magic about that in one place. It's a state of mind. It's an openness to risk, and it's a kind of energy that can exist elsewhere and should exist elsewhere. So I'd encourage that, and I think what's happening in Boise is a fantastic and completely unsurprising thing to witness.
Well, you'd obviously be welcome in Boise if you decide to flee the temperatures and the fires, and you won't even have to reprogram your brain, because Boise is also in the valley, the Treasure Valley. Yeah, so a lot of people don't know that. But when you talk about the valley in Idaho, you're talking about Treasure Valley.
Treasure Valley.
All right, so let's talk about your new thing. So your new effort is around the decentralized web. There's probably a lot you could say about that. But why don't you start by telling us what it is? What kinds of solutions are you bringing to what kinds of issues? And probably inextricably intertwined with that is going to be, what is your entrepreneurial take on this? Like what is the company that you're trying to start, or the organization you're trying to start? What problems is it created to solve? And then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, I don't want to pitch you on a specific company idea or mine, and I should say,
might be an investor listening.
Well, I should say at this stage, things are pre-launch. I'll just speak in broad strokes right now. We don't have a brand out in the world. I've just been a few months into collaborating with a co-founder who actually has made a lot of technical progress, but there's nothing there consumable or visible yet. If things go to plan, 6 months from now, that'll be different. But let me just speak a bit about what it is that's motivating me and what we're trying to do. Broadly speaking, we identify two big categories of problem out there. This is a moonshot kind of aspiration, to be clear. It's the kind of thing that my younger self would have said, why don't we try something that's a little higher probability of success, but aims at something a bit smaller. One of those big problems is an extraordinary concentration of economic and computing power in a very small number of hands. And I'm not the first by any means to observe this. This has been a source of growing alarm for a lot of people. You may have seen the Netflix show, The Social Dilemma, which I think did quite a good job at articulating just what's so menacing about that. It's a concentration not just of extraordinary capital and talent and computing power, but also of data, of our personal information. And there's a very disturbing kind of virtuous, or actually the opposite of that, kind of a menacing cycle of increasing concentration that's led to a whole set of ills that I think there's a lot of reason to worry about. There's about misinformation, about kind of balkanization of our epistemic fabric, about just extraordinary undemocratic powers being concentrated in just a few individuals who may have the best intentions, but are causing a lot of damage to our civil society and democracy now. It's gone under one big broad rubric that I think has a great name that was recently given to it by an intellectual, Shoshana Zuboff, called the surveillance capitalism. So we've exchanged, we have all these extraordinary digital services, but and they're supposedly free, but we have paid for them very dearly, with our personal information, and arguably, this is a bit melodramatic, but arguably with our sovereignty and our dignity, and possibly our democracy. And so that's one big problem: a huge concentration of power in the current form of the internet and indeed the public cloud. Extraordinary powers, extraordinary services, but at a very, very high price. There's a second one that most people don't think of as a problem, and if it is a problem, I've been one of the perpetrators of it as a software entrepreneur, and that's proprietary software development. It's the basic approach of you get a group of technical, you get a lot of technical talent together, and then you build a software product, and that product is then under your proprietary control. It's a corporate asset. And that model has brought us a lot of extraordinary things, but I, along with others, have become convinced that it has some very deep limitations. And one of those limitations is that our information gets fragmented across many different domains, and that we, as the owners of that information, can't unify it, and are fragmented across many different places, and that it inhibits the kind of collaboration and interoperability that's kind of fundamental to good software development. So I could elaborate more on both of these themes, but both of those have kind of led to a number of people believing in the power of decentralization and saying that we should return to the roots of the internet, which was decentralized, it was open, it was interoperable, it wasn't under massive corporate control. And there have been many theories about how that could happen. Some of them are very academic, some of them are very kind of regulatory in nature, like the government should do something about this. My view is not so much because I'm a libertarian or distrust the government, but I've just been humbled by how hard it is to write good policy, even for a single company, let alone for a whole country, or let alone for the internet. And so I'm an entrepreneur, and I think that the improvement comes with better entrepreneurial solutions, with alternatives that you can provide consumers to say, hey, you can get these digital services. There's nothing that requires you to strip naked and be surveilled in order to be able to communicate to your friends and family, to share information with other people. That shouldn't be a requirement. And there's a sovereign way that you should be able to manage your own information. So that's a lot of preamble to say, basically the idea is, can we create a new set of essentially peer-to-peer decentralized technologies for us to live our digital lives, which of course are not going away, it's only going to increase, but in a way that's not subject to central control, to surveillance, to monetization of our dignity, And can we do that in a way that's entrepreneurially successful? And to make that happen, you have to do, you can't boil the ocean. You can't say, hey, 4.2 billion Facebook users, there's an alternative with a big billboard. It doesn't work that way. You have to identify a subset of people who care enough about that you can create a compelling enough functional value proposition to that they want to try something else. And on the basis of that, you can maybe slowly expand the circle. Jeff Bezos didn't, he might have had a vision for Amazon being a superstore for everything, but it's not like that was the V1 of Amazon. The first version of Amazon was was a store for academic textbooks. And it was very narrow in scope, but it did that well. And by doing that well, it earned the opportunity to try something bigger, to expand to, other easily portable, non-perishable things, and expand from there into what we know it is today. And I think that's what's lacking. Alternatives to the current surveillance-based, hegemonic world that we live in technology, that can start with something modest but problem solving, and then can grow into something bigger if it earns the right.
Got it. It's a big vision. Just a quick comment, and then another question. It strikes me as we're talking now that when I talk to entrepreneurs like you who have tussled with big problems over long periods of time, successfully or unsuccessfully, but who have engaged, problems that have a lot of inertia, I guess, is one way to think about it, that you're not afraid to tussle with something that's intellectually demanding. I think, just like the best minds of our generation are potentially wasted on showing people ads. I think some of our best founders are wasted on thinking about growth hacking. Yes. And that kind of thing. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I appreciate you. I'm glad somebody like you is thinking about this problem. So question is, a lot of what you just said, probably rhymes with blockchain to some of the people listening. So maybe talk about what part, cryptographic protocols and or blockchain and or, other such distributed ledger techniques or whatever, how do they play in that? Sure. And then talk about what critical mass looks like.
Sure. So blockchain is a fascinating technology. I think it would be a lot less fascinating to people if it weren't for Bitcoin's breakout success a couple of years ago, which suddenly, which blew everyone's mind. And I think it kind of motivated people, and this often happens in technology, to say, well, how can we apply this to every single problem that we have in the world? And of course, it's not suited for that. It's a very, very clever idea that's very useful for solving one category of problem, which is when you need to get global consensus without a central authority. It turns out that's useful to do in certain situations, but it's only one of multiple decentralized technologies. There's been federated, distributed, peer-to-peer. There's been all kinds of other technologies that have different variations on that understanding. How can you create a linkage between people, between parties, that does not require central orchestration, central control, and of course, central surveillance and data aggregation? And I think we're at the very early stages of people trying to apply these different technologies, decentralized technologies, together in a way that's actually useful, that actually solves a problem. So a lot of technology goes through this first phase where I would call it fetishistic. It's like, this is a cool idea. This is really clever. There's got to be money here somewhere. Let's just go for it. Where without a lot of deep thought on what's the use case that we're trying to satisfy? Who will be better off as a result of it? And does this technology actually help, or does it just over-engineer a solution? I'll give you an example of that. With blockchain, I know the insurance industry reasonably well. And, there's a theory you could put insurance on the blockchain. Everyone could agree on contracts that are all encoded in blockchain. And in fact, some people have tried to do that. Some entrepreneurs have, but none of them have really created a compelling reason why that's better than the way that we handle insurance today. You have a legal contract, and when the indemnifying conditions are triggered, then there's a claim. And blockchain doesn't really add anything to that situation. So I just think that that's another example. And the same thing we saw with artificial intelligence, when there were a million different projects and companies that were applying AI to a million things. Of course, artificial intelligence techniques are extraordinarily powerful, but that doesn't mean that it can be sprinkled like fairy dust on any problem and solve it. So I think that we're in the infancy of understanding how decentralized technologies can be applied towards the problems that I described earlier that many people are worried about. And there'll be and there's been a lot of silliness, as there always is with any new technology, but that there will be things that are genuinely useful. I was asked by a friend, if blockchain is so incredible, like why aren't there any why isn't there anything useful to do with it besides trade Bitcoin? And my answer to him was, well, think about the age of like personal computers, right? And there's a great show also on Netflix, Halt and Catch Fire, about the early days of personal computing, which I think is awesome and kind of
Cameron is my spirit animal.
Yeah, exactly. Required viewing by any entrepreneur, because it really talks about those early days. But anyway, at that time, in 1980, you would be reasonable to ask, like, well, why do I need a personal computer anyway? What is it going to do? The applications that they could offer a typical household were like, maybe you could store your coupons on it. Like it's like a big, heavy $2,500 calculator. What is it for? Wasn't so clear. But eventually, of course, people recognized, look, this could be transformative of our life. It could, mostly in good ways, hopefully mostly in good ways. And those use cases had to emerge over time. And those that found those and substantiated those were very, very richly rewarded. So I predict, this is not some bold prediction. I think this is just obvious, kind of common entrepreneurial sense that, the same thing will happen for decentralized technologies. And I think that the time is now, when there is really a growing mass concern with the price that we have paid for hyper concentration, the opposite of decentralization, in just a few companies.
Yeah, no, that resonates greatly with me. I've done a lot of work in autonomous things, mm-hmm. autonomous vehicles in specific, and particularly from the insurance perspective, mm-hmm. a lot of the work we did. And the only use case I've actually ever seen where I'm at all compelled around blockchain and insurance is different modes. So modal contracts. So the basic contract is the contract that you sign. You can sign it in a pen. Nobody cares, right? You've got the contract, like you said. But the pricing can change on a minute by minute basis, depending on whether you've got a passenger on board, if you have 3 passengers on board, if you are empty and going to get a new passenger. And so that's the only compelling case I've ever seen. And it's not clear to me, it's one of those things that seems like, it probably should exist because it's fair, but one of the things that, probably will never come to exist because it's not actually that good for anybody.
Well, there are a lot of ideas like that. And, one consequence of having too much capital around is that sometimes ideas that haven't really been thought through rigorously get capitalized and then, kind of muddy the water and confuse people. But some of that creative destruction is intrinsic to, to capitalism and it usually leads to the right place, things that actually people want to buy and that actually solve their problems.
That is the best use of creative destruction. I'm stealing that. We're creatively destroying the venture capital.
I like it. A friend of mine likes to use, which he says, well, there's a lot of ideas that are just basically out there because of venture philanthropy, which is, a polite way of saying money that's gone to where it really shouldn't have. But it's okay. It's part of the process.
I hope you'll be okay that I'm ripping that one off too. I'm actually writing that down. That's awesome. She's very smart. All right. So what does critical mass for your enterprise look like?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so sorry, that I'm not even sure you can have an answer to that question. Let me ask you a better question. So, what's the general shape of version 0 going to be? Mm-hmm. And what are your ambitions? I don't know, 5 or 10 years out, like how many people are going to be using your software if you have the home run situation?
Sure. We're taking the approach, which again is not novel to us. Others have, others who are trying to build a platform. In fact, I think anyone building a platform, what could be called a platform today, would take a similar approach. And that's, can we enlist technical interest? Can we get this universe of, 10 million software developers out there, some paid, some unpaid, some working for corporate jobs, others on their own. But can we get them interested in this approach, in this stack that we're offering, that they can do useful things with? And then, can we support them? Can we onboard them? Can we give them the tools they need to feel like they can build useful things? And then if so, maybe we can attract some of those mythical creatures we call end users to come and actually try it out. And one other element to our particular idea is a kind of economic model that would help compensate or allow for an economic exchange between developer and end user today in a way that's mediated only by corporations, but we think ought to be a much more peer-to-peer kind of relationship. So what does critical mass look like? In the beginning, it's a small number of engineers, developers, on the order of magnitude of 50 or fewer, who are building interesting things that can, and they themselves will dog food, and as we like to say, use their own software and build things that will primarily attract, I think, a more technical audience, but will have a generality that will expand from there if things go well. The way I think about, in any market, you have to think about what's your demand curve. What are the concentric circles of people who would be interested in what you're doing? And what encourages me so much on this category of idea is if you think about, like let's say 10 years ago, there were people who were, terrified and paranoid about the loss of our privacy, and they were shouting about it, but no one was really listening. And there were some academics who were saying, this is a little bit worrying, and this is feeling a bit hegemonic and monopolistic. We seem to be trending, but again, not many people were listening. Then you have people who were really involved in the technology world, who kind of understood how technologies worked and said, this is also a little bit concerning. And then there were, so there was a curve of people who had varying degrees of worry. And then there was a mass audience that said, this is great, everything is free, I have no concerns.
Right.
Basically, every link on that curve has now shifted in one direction. People who said we were worried, they're like, we're seriously worried. This is a big problem. People who said these technologies could evolve in a way that would be malevolent have said it's happened. It's malevolent today. We're seeing direct consequences in our civil society. And even ordinary people who didn't give much of a thought of it were saying, I'm feeling more and more uncomfortable about how much I'm being surveilled and what my kids are doing online. So you're seeing a wholesale shift in one direction. And that's the kind of thing as an entrepreneur that really, that kind of conditions your strategy, because you say, we're betting on the right side of history here. Like, we're going to be on the right side of history. The wind is blowing in this one direction. And if that's true, then you don't need an enormous start in the beginning to grow into something bigger. If you're on the wrong side of history, it doesn't matter if maybe everybody likes you, because eventually they're not going to. They're moving away. But I think the gravity is pulling very, very definitively in one way these days.
Yeah. Well, you started Guidewire with a strong strategic thesis, and you're starting this with a strong strategic thesis. I like it. I think it's interesting that your kind of end user audience is going to be, your potentially addressable market is going to be split very neatly into two. It's going to be people who know that they're in a bubble, because most people don't experience surveillance; they experience being in a bubble, right?
Yeah. That's right.
And so you're going to have people who know they're in a bubble and don't like it, and you're going to have people who don't know they're in a bubble. And that first group is your potential user base. So we're at the end here. We are out of time. I'm being virtually waved at. So I'll just say, this was fascinating. I could talk to you for another hour, and maybe we should do that another time. And this, for anybody who's interested, this should come with a reading list, of course. So I won't give a complete reading list, but definitely read Surveillance Capitalism that Marcus mentioned earlier. I'll throw in The Transparent Society, which Marcus and I talked about when we prepared for this. Both very good books. One is 25 or 30 years in the rearview mirror. It was written in the 90s. And so comparing it to Shoshana's book is illuminating. I guess I will ask then if you have any closing thoughts for us.
No, it's been a pleasure and privilege to be part of this. And I think entrepreneurs are the engine of social improvement, and as long as you bring a conscience to it, it's the engine of progress and the basis to be hopeful about our future. So I'm thrilled to play however small a role here, just as a participant. Thank you.
Right on. Well, we really appreciate you spending time with us. And with that, we'll say thanks and see you next time.